He buried his smile the day his wife died. Then a trembling stranger appeared. The axe handle had cracked sometime in the night. I didn't notice till I was 3 swings into the morning and the wood started twisting wrong in my grip. I stood there looking at it. The grain had split from the eye down about 4 inches. Still usable if you were careful. I wasn't being careful about much anymore. That was November. I know it was November because the cottonwoods along the creek had gone bare about a week before, and the first real cold had come in behind them. The kind that doesn't apologize, doesn't dip back into warmth for a few days the way October cold does. Just settles, sets its weight down and stays. I put the axe against the woodpile and went inside and made coffee. There was a pot of it left from yesterday. I drank that first, cold as it was. The fire in the stove had gone to ash overnight and I hadn't rebuilt it yet. I do that some mornings, wait longer than I should to get the stove going, drink cold coffee, let myself be cold for a while. Ruth would have said something about that. She would have had the fire up before first light, would have been across the room already when I came in, hair pinned up but not all the way, some of it still loose from the night. She'd have looked at the cold coffee and not said a word, just poured it out and handed me fresh. She'd been gone 14 months. I'm not going to tell you it gets easier the way some people say. Some mornings it gets easier, some mornings it doesn't. That morning with the cracked axe handle and the cold coffee, it wasn't one of the easy ones. I sat at the table looking at nothing in particular, a knot in the wood of the wall, a place where the chinking had cracked and I kept meaning to fix it, and I just sat there. Not thinking, just not moving. The place was called the Rafter T, 60-some acres along Crow Creek in the southeast corner of the territory, good bottom ground, decent grass in the draws, a spring that didn't fail even in bad summers. My father had filed on it, built the first cabin. I'd built a better one on top of the old foundation after he died, added a room when Ruth came. The room she came to was the room I didn't go in anymore. My name is Calvin Trask. I was 53 years old that November, though I felt older. I had good hands, Ruth used to say that I had the best hands she'd ever seen on a man, steady and sure. And I had the land, and I had a rough-coated brown gelding named Pad that I'd owned for 11 years and trusted completely. I had a dog, a blue heeler named Ferris that had been more Ruth's dog than mine, who still slept on the west side of the bed where she used to sleep and looked at me sometimes in a way that was almost accusatory. What I didn't have anymore was any particular reason to do things past what had to get done. The cattle were looked after, the fences held, the roof stayed sound. I paid my bills at the mercantile in Harker, bought my salt and flour and coffee and whiskey, nodded to the men I knew in town, and came back home and did it all again. There is a version of living that's really just waiting, and I had settled into it the way a stone settles into a riverbed. Not suffering, exactly. Just stopped. I was splitting what was left of the morning wood, working around the crack in the handle, when I heard the horse. Single horse coming from the north, moving slow. Not the easy slow of a man riding easy, the careful slow of something wrong. I set the axe down and listened. You learn to hear a difference in how horses move. A sound horse has a rhythm to it. This one was picking its steps. I went around the corner of the woodshed and saw it come through the gap in the fence line. Gray mare, one white stocking. She was limping on the left front and she was blowing hard, sides heaving like she'd been run and hadn't cooled. And in the saddle I had to look twice. A woman, sitting sideways half off, one hand knotted in the mare's mane. Her head was down. She had a brown coat on, too thin for the weather, and her hair was loose and dark and hanging over her face, and she wasn't holding the reins, just the mane. The reins were looped on the saddle horn. The mare stopped when she saw me, just stopped, right there in the yard, and lowered her head and stood, like she'd done what she came to do. I walked out to them. The woman didn't look up. I got close enough to see her hands. The one in the mane was white-knuckled. The other was hanging loose at her side, and there was blood on the sleeve. Not fresh blood. dried, brown, soaked into the fabric from something that had bled a while back. I said, "Can you hear me?" She made a sound, not a word, just a sound that meant yes. I said, "I'm going to lift you down, all right." She didn't answer that. I took it as permission. I got my hands under her arms and brought her down, and when she came down she couldn't hold her own weight at all, just folded against me, both hands grabbing at my coat, face pressed into my chest, trembling. The kind of trembling that's not just cold. That's been going on too long. She weighed almost nothing. I could feel her ribs. I said, "You're all right, you're down, I got you." She kept trembling, didn't let go of my coat. I held her there a minute. Pad was watching from the corral. Ferris had come out onto the porch and was watching with his head low. The mare stood behind us making a sound in her throat, exhausted, trusting. I got the woman inside. She was not in good shape. Once I got her coat off, I could see the arm she'd been cut, a long, shallow gash on the outside of her forearm, like from a knife that hadn't gone deep but had gone mean. Someone had wrapped it, and not well, a strip torn from something, tied too loose, and it had slipped. The cut had stopped bleeding on its own, but it was dirty. I'd seen infected cuts before. I'd lost an animal to one, and a man I knew had lost fingers. I didn't waste time. I got the fire going first, because she needed to be warm, and I put water on, and I cleaned the wound as well as I knew how with what I had: carbolic, clean cloth, the last of a tin of drawing salve Ruth had kept for exactly this kind of thing. The woman sat still through it. She winced hard once when I pressed the cloth down, but she didn't make a sound. Her jaw was set. She was watching my hands. When I'd tied it off, I looked up at her. She was maybe 30, maybe a little under. Dark eyes, dark hair still tangled from the ride. A face that might have been pretty when it wasn't this tired. There was a bruise along her jawline, yellow at the edges, a few days old. She had the look of someone who had been afraid for a long time, and had gotten past the point where the fear surprised her anymore. I said, "What's your name?" She looked at me for a second before she answered, like she was deciding something. "Nora," she said. "Nora Vane." "Calvin Trask, this is the Rafter tea." She nodded like that meant something to her, like she'd been trying to get somewhere and wasn't sure she had. I said, "When did you eat last?" She thought about it. That worried me more than anything else, that she had to think about it. "Yesterday morning," she said, "some of it." I cooked. I didn't ask anything else right then. I put salt pork in the pan and sliced the last of a loaf of bread and put a full cup of coffee in front of her and watched her get some warmth back into her hands around the cup. She ate slowly, the way you eat when you know you shouldn't eat fast even though every part of you wants to. There was a discipline in it. This was not a woman who had been helpless her whole life. Something had happened to her, something recent. When she was done, she sat back in the chair and looked at the table and then at me. She said, "I'm not going back." I said, "I didn't ask you to." She looked at me again, that measuring look. "I need to stay somewhere," she said. "A few days, until I can figure out where to go." I thought about it for about 2 seconds. "All right," I said. I gave her the room off the kitchen, the one Ruth and I had used to store things until we had more use for it, where I'd put a spare cot after Ruth died because I couldn't sleep in our room anymore for the first few months. It wasn't much. It was warm. The woman, Nora, sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the floor, and I thought she was going to say something. But instead she just lay down still in her clothes and was asleep inside of a minute. I went back out and saw to the mare. She had a bruised hoof, that was the limp. Not a stone bruise, something she'd run on too hard for too long on rough ground. I cleaned it and poulticed it and put her in the corral with Pad, who sniffed at her and then went back to his hay with his usual indifference to things he had already categorized. I checked her over. She was thin too, ribs showing, water deprived. She'd been pushed and not fed properly for a while. Someone had used this animal hard. I thought about what that told me while I worked. A woman on a hard-ridden horse with a cut on her arm and a bruise on her jaw who said she wasn't going back. There wasn't much gray area in that picture. I went in and made more coffee and sat with it and thought about whether any of this was my business. I was a man alone on 60 acres who had no particular claims on anything beyond that fence line. Whatever had happened to Nora Vane had happened somewhere else and would sort itself out somewhere else. She needed a few days. I had a few days. That was as far as my thinking needed to go. Except that I found myself up at 3 in the morning, the way I hadn't been in a long time, awake and alert, listening to the house, to the sounds it made, to the small movements from the room down the hall that said she was still there, still breathing, still all right. I lay in the dark and listened, and there was something in that, something that surprised me, something that felt almost like being needed again. I pushed it away, went back to sleep. In the morning, she was up before me. I came out and the fire was going, and the coffee was on. I stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at that for a second. She was at the stove with her back to me, a cloth wrapped around the handle of the coffee pot, the one Ruth had always used to protect her hand. She heard me stop and turned around. She still looked tired, but there was color in her face. She had braided her hair. "I found the coffee," she said, "and the flour. I hope you don't mind." She'd made biscuits. They were in the pan, brown on top, and the kitchen smelled like them. I said, "I don't mind." We ate without much talking. She moved carefully with the arm, the bandaged one. She didn't baby it, just was careful. When she reached for something, she reached with the other one first, and I watched her make the small adjustments a person makes when they've accepted a hurt and worked around it rather than letting it stop them. After a while she said, "I'll work for the days I'm here. I don't want to be a burden." I said, "You're not a burden." "I'm not asking," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do." I looked at her across the table. She looked back. "All right," I said. There was a long pause and then she said, "Your wife." I said, "What?" "The photograph on the shelf and things around the house." She was matter-of-fact about it, not gentle, just stating what she'd seen. "She's not here." "No," I said. "I'm sorry." 14 months, I said. I don't know why I told her how long it had been. I hadn't told many people how long it had been. Most people in Harker knew, and I hadn't talked to them about it. She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it. Didn't say it would get better or that Ruth was in a better place or any of the things people say that don't help. Just nodded, like she was acknowledging something real. That was the first thing I noticed about Nora Vane. She didn't fill the air with words that weren't useful. She was good at work. Better than I expected, though I don't know what I expected. She was small and she'd been running scared and she was nursing a bad arm, but she got things done. She knew how to work around a ranch. Not like she'd grown up on one, but like she'd been around enough of one that the rhythms were familiar. She started with the kitchen and moved to the yard. I found her one afternoon with a broom going at the porch, sweeping the dried mud and pine needles that had built up since probably the summer, working in long strokes, braid over one shoulder. I watched her for a minute from across the yard. Ferris was sitting on the porch steps watching her too, which was something. Ferris didn't usually take to people that fast. I went back to what I was doing. That night she asked if I had mending that needed doing. I brought out a shirt and a pair of trousers that had been piled in the corner of the bedroom, for I didn't know how long things I'd been putting off, and she sat at the table near the lamp and put it right. Her stitches were small and even, better than mine. I sat across from her working on a piece of leather harness and we didn't talk, just worked, and the lamp was yellow between us and the stove ticked as it cooled down. It was a strange kind of quiet. The room had been quiet for 14 months, but it had been empty quiet. This was something else. I went to bed unsettled by it, not badly, just unsettled. On the third day, I found out what she was running from. She didn't tell me all of it. I don't think she told me all of it for a long time. But the piece she told me that third day was enough. She had a husband, had. She said it with that past tense that wasn't quite past tense yet because the thing was still happening. His name was Deward Vane, and he ran cattle and other things, dirtier things, out of a place called the Anchor, spread about 40 miles north and west of me, up near the Wyoming line. She had married him when she was 22, and she had been trying to leave him for 3 years, and every time she tried he found her. She had a sister in Colorado, in Pueblo, and she had been trying to get to the sister. That was it. That was the whole story in about 100 words. She said it without drama, like she was reading a bill of sale. Her hands were folded on the table and she looked at them while she talked. I said, "How'd you end up coming south? Pueblo's east, not south." She said, "He had men on the eastern roads. I went the other way and figured I'd turn when I could." I said, "The arm." She said, "His foreman. He caught me the first night. The arm was when I got away from him." I sat with that for a second. I said, "Will they track you here?" "They'll track me somewhere," she said. "That's why I can't stay long." I nodded. "How long do you need?" She said, "The mare needs another week, maybe 10 days. She can't carry me hard until the hoof heals." "Then you'll stay 10 days," I said. She looked at me. "You understand what I'm telling you, if Deward comes looking." "I understand," I said. She held my eyes for a moment. "You don't know him." "I know the kind," I said. She went back to her hands. Then she said quietly, "I'm sorry to bring this to your door." I said, "Don't be." There wasn't anything else to say about it. I got up and put another piece of wood in the stove and came back, and we sat there for a while longer without talking, and then we went to our separate rooms, and I lay in the dark and thought about what I just said. Don't be. I hadn't said anything like that, anything that felt like it meant something, in a long time. A week went by. She was up every morning before me. Every morning the fire was going and the coffee was on. I stopped being surprised by it, which itself surprised me, how fast a thing like that can slide into what feels ordinary, what feels expected. The first morning I walked out and saw the fire she'd lit, I stood there. By the 5th morning I walked out and poured my coffee and sat down, and that was all there was to it. She kept her distance without being cold. There was a measure to it, a way she had of being in the same space without pressing. She didn't ask much. She didn't explain herself. She did what she said she'd do, worked for her keep, and worked well, and she listened when I talked and didn't talk when she had nothing to say, and bit by bit that quality started to feel not like absence but like presence, like the particular silence of someone who is paying attention. I caught myself talking more than I had in a year, not about anything extraordinary. About the fence line on the south pasture that kept trying to wash out every spring. About the trouble I'd had with a steer last summer, a big roan that had learned to lift the gate latch with his nose and kept letting the others out. About the spring up in the hills, the way it smelled in March when the ice went off it, mineral and cold, the cleanest thing I knew. She listened to all of it like it was worth listening to. One afternoon near the end of the week, I was in the barn working on pads near Hind's shoe. It had started to spread, and I wanted to nail it back before it gave him trouble, and she came in to check on the gray mare. She didn't know I was there, or didn't know I could see her, and I watched her from under Pad's belly while she ran her hands down the mare's leg and lifted the hoof and looked at it. Careful hands. She talked to the horse while she did it. Low words, not words I could make out, just the tone of it, the particular tone of someone who loves an animal and has had a long time to learn how. She set the hoof down, and the mare turned her head and breathed on the woman's hair, and Nora Vane put her forehead against the mare's cheek and closed her eyes. I looked away. It felt like something private. That night at supper, she said the hoof was coming on well. I said I'd seen her looking at it. She said she'd had the mare 6 years, had bought her as a 3-year-old from a man in Nebraska who didn't deserve her. I said she was a good animal. Nora said she was the best one. There was something plain and fierce in the way she said it, and I understood that the mare was more than a horse, was a piece of a life she'd been trying to preserve through everything that had happened. I said, she'll be ready in 3 or 4 more days, I think. She said, that's what I figure too. There was a quiet. Then she said, I keep thinking about what it'll look like when I get there, the sister's house. I said, is it a good place? She said, I think so. I've never been. She writes good letters. She thought about it. She married a man who's a surveyor. They have a house with a fence around it and a garden. She half smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her do that. A small, wondering smile, like she was trying to believe the thing was real. A garden, she said again. I said, that sounds like something worth getting to. She looked at me. The smile softened into something quieter. It does, she said. On the 8th day they came. 2 of them mid-morning, riding in from the north the way she'd come. I saw them from the corral, saw them while they were still a 1/4 mile out. 2 men moving with the particular purpose of men who know where they're going and aren't asking permission. I went inside. Nora was at the stove. I said, 2 riders coming in from the north. Stay in the kitchen. She went still. Then she moved to the window and looked out and came back. The one on the gray horse is Deward's foreman, she said. His name is Pollard, a beat. He's the one who cut me. I looked at her. She was holding herself very still, not shaking past shaking, but the color had drained out of her face. I said, go to your room, take the bar. She said, Calvin. I said, bar it and don't open it for anyone but me. You'll know my knock. She looked at me for another second, then she went. I put on my coat and went out onto the porch and waited. They rode up to the yard and stopped. The foreman was a lean man, maybe 40, a jaw like a wedge and cold eyes that did a lot of work while his face did nothing. The other one was younger and heavier, and was trying to look dangerous and mostly succeeded. The foreman said, morning. He was looking at the house, not at me. I said, morning. Looking for a woman, he said. Dark hair, come through here maybe a week and a half ago, riding a gray mare. I said, lots of people come through. He smiled. It didn't make his face look warmer. This one stand out. She belongs to a man named Vane, Deward Vane, you know him. Can't say I do, I said. He looked at me for a while. He was deciding what kind of man I was. I gave him nothing to work with. I just stood on my porch with my hands at my sides and looked back at him the way you look at something that has come onto your land. Mr. Vane would be grateful, the foreman said, to anyone who helped him find his wife. I said, I'll keep that in mind. The foreman shifted in his saddle. Thing is, he said, we tracked her this direction, fairly clean track, woman alone on a lame horse. He was still looking at the house. I said, tracks go a lot of directions out here. Wind changes things. The young one was watching me now too. His hand was resting near his belt. It was resting there in the particular way of someone who wants you to notice it. I said, that hand bothers you. You ought to have it looked at. The young one said, what? The way you're holding it, I said, looks like it causes you trouble. There was a silence. The foreman looked at the young one, and the young one's hand moved away from his belt. We'll have a look around, the foreman said, if that's all right. I said, it's not. He said, Mr. Trask, I said, Calvin Trask, and no, you won't have a look around. You're on my land and I didn't invite you to it. You want to make something out of that, we can settle it. Otherwise, you're welcome to keep riding south. He held my eyes for a long time. He was the kind of man who didn't get told no much, and you could see him working through it, deciding whether I was worth the trouble. Finally he said, she's heading to her sister's, in Colorado. You hear anything about a woman traveling south, you tell her Deward's coming. I'll do that, I said. He turned his horse. The younger one followed. They went back the way they came, south past the gate, and I watched them until they were beyond the fence line and shrinking into the distance. I went inside. I knocked on her door. 3 knocks, then 2, the pattern I'd told her. She opened it immediately. She'd been standing right against the door. She said, "What happened?" I said, "They're gone." She let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep. I said, "That was the foreman." "Pollard," she said. "He said his piece and left. I think he believed me." She leaned against the doorframe. Her eyes were bright in a way I'd learned to read as her fighting something down. "You didn't have to do that," she said. I said, "Yes, I did." She looked at me. She said quietly, "They'll go to the next place. Ask again, come back." I said, "Then you leave tonight." She blinked. "Tonight?" "They're riding south. By tonight they'll be a ways gone. You go north, curve east, then cut south for the Colorado Road. I'll ride with you to the territory line." She stood very still. I said, "The mare's good enough for a careful ride. We go easy, rest her when we need to." She said, "Calvin, just my name, not a question." I said, "You've got a garden to get to." We left at dusk. I packed what she'd need: food for 3 days, a blanket, the carbolic, and some clean cloth for the arm in case. I put Ruth's winter coat on her. Nora didn't argue about it. It was warmer than what she had, and Ruth was not coming back for it, and I had decided that slowly over the past few days without knowing I'd decided it. I helped her into the saddle and checked the mare's girth and looked up at her. She said, "You're sure about this?" I said, "I've been sure about less." I went and got Pad from the corral and swung up, and we rode out through the gate. We went north first, as I'd said. The land was cold and the sky was clear, and the stars were the particular dense mass they get in November, more stars than dark between them. We didn't talk much. The horses moved at an easy walk, the mare keeping up without trouble, her stride even. I listened to the night and watched the ridgelines, and we put miles behind us. Around midnight we stopped at a creek I knew, let the horses drink and blow. She got down and moved around to keep warm. I made a small fire with dry wood. It wouldn't carry far, and we sat close to it and drank from the canteen I'd brought. She said, "Tell me about Ruth." I looked at the fire. "You don't have to," she said. I said, "No, it's all right." I thought about where to start. She came out here from Ohio. She'd been a school teacher. I didn't meet her until she'd been in the territory 2 years. She was teaching at the schoolhouse in Harker. I had business there one afternoon, and she was coming out of the store as I was going in. She had a stack of books, and she was arguing with herself about something. I could see it on her face. A whole debate happening in there that I wasn't part of. Nora smiled. "I held the door for her," I said. She thanked me without looking at me, like she was still in the middle of the argument. I thought about her for a week. What was she arguing about? She told me later, whether to spend the last of her money on a primer or a reader for the class. The reader won. Nora laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd heard from her, soft and warm. I said she was stubborn. She had strong opinions about most things, and she wasn't shy about them. She thought I was too quiet the first year, said she couldn't tell what I was thinking. I told her that was fine. She thought enough for both of us. What did she say to that? She threw a dish rag at me. I looked at the fire. She was the best person I've ever known. Not easy, she had edges and she knew it, and she didn't apologize for them. But good. Honest and good and completely herself. A silence. I said, "When she got sick it happened fast. 6 weeks from the first sign to the end. That's the part I still haven't made peace with. 6 weeks. Nora said nothing. She was watching me. I said, "I closed up after. I know I did. It was easier. Easier to just keep moving, keep the ranch running, not feel much." I pushed at the fire with a stick. I got pretty good at not feeling much. She said, "Until a stranger came through on a lame horse." I looked at her. "I know what you did for me," she said. "I knew what it cost you just to let me in the door. I could see it." I said, "I didn't do anything anyone decent wouldn't do." She shook her head slow. "You gave me the coat," she said. Her coat. I looked at the fire again. She said, "That's not a small thing, Calvin." The fire ticked and the horses moved behind us. The cold pressed in at our backs and the warmth pressed out from in front of us, and I sat with what she'd said. I said, "I think she would have liked you." Nora said, "What makes you think so?" "The way you work," I said. She respected that. She respected people who got on with things. "So do you," she said. I didn't say anything. After a while she said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "All right." She was looking at the fire. "When I rode in that day, when your mare stopped in your yard and I couldn't hold on anymore." She paused. "I'd been telling myself for about 2 days that I was going to be fine, that I knew where I was going and I'd get there. I was telling myself that right up until the moment I wasn't on the horse anymore and you had me, and I just couldn't hold the story together for one more second." She stopped. She was quiet for a bit. "Then you said, 'You're all right, you're down, I got you.'" She said those words exactly the way I'd said them, or close to it. She had them stored somewhere. "I can't tell you what that was," she said, "to hear someone say that. After what I'd been through, I didn't know you, I'd never seen you in my life, but there was something in the way you said it, like it was true because you said it, like you'd decided it." I said I had. She looked at me then, full on. The firelight was in her eyes. She said, "You're a good man, Calvin Trask." I looked at her. I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in 14 months, something that was almost pain, the way feeling comes back into a cold hand, that particular deep ache of blood moving into something that's been still too long. I said, "I've been told that before." She said, "By someone who was right." We sat there by that fire for a while longer, long enough that I stopped noticing the cold. Long enough that, when it was time to go, I almost didn't want to. The territory line was a day and a half's riding from where I'd left her, and I knew that, and I'd told her I'd ride with her to the line. I told myself that was what I was doing, getting her to the line. But when we were a day out from the line and she'd asked me once or twice about Colorado, about the roads, about the mountains, about where you crossed the pass that time of year, I found I knew the answers. I'd come up through Colorado territory once, years back before Ruth, and I knew those roads better than most men in the territory. I knew where the passes closed early and where they didn't. I knew the valley the surveyors worked in, the one near Pueblo, the particular lay of the land. She didn't ask me to come. But somewhere in the middle of the second day, in the pale afternoon light with the mountains showing purple on the horizon for the first time, she said, "You know this country south of here?" I said, "Some of it." She said, "Better than I do." I said, "Almost certainly." She was quiet for a mile or two, then she said, "The ranch." I said, "It'll keep." She turned in the saddle and looked at me. I looked back at her. She said, "If you come to Colorado," she stopped, started again. "If you come to Colorado, I can't promise you anything. I don't know what I'm going to find. I don't know what I'm going to be on the other end of all this." I said, "I'm not asking you to promise me anything." She said, "You'd ride through the mountains in November because you know the roads." I said, "That's one reason." She held my eyes for a long moment. The wind came off the mountains and pushed her hair back, and her eyes were dark and steady, and there was something in them that I recognized, the same thing I'd seen in the barn when she pressed her forehead to the mare's cheek. Something held carefully, something given carefully but given. She said, "All right then." We rode on. "I'm going to skip the mountain crossing." Not because it wasn't hard, it was. The last pass had ice and we went slow, and there was one night where I wasn't sure we'd cleared it in time. But that's not the part that matters. What matters is what happened on the other side. We came down into the valley on a gray morning, the kind of morning where the light is even and everything is quiet. There were cattle in the near fields, black against the frost, and smoke coming from a chimney about a mile off. Nora sat up in her saddle. She'd been tired from the crossing. We both had been, but she sat up and looked at that smoke, and something changed in her face. She said that's the road she told me. You take the road past the first fence, then the second gate. We went the way she said, past the first fence, past the second gate, which had an iron T on the post. And then she saw the house. It was a plain house, board and batten, with a fence around it like she'd said, and the fence had what would be a garden in it come spring, bare right now, mounded over with straw for the winter, the careful straight rows of it visible. A real garden, tended. Nora made a sound. Just a sound, not a word, but I heard everything that was in it, the 14 months of her own kind of silence, the waiting, the running, the holding on. All of it finding its end in this plain house with this plain garden behind its fence. A woman came out of the house. She was lighter than Nora, older by a few years, and she saw us and stopped on the porch. Then she came down the steps fast and was halfway across the yard before Nora was even down from the mare. And then they were holding each other in the road, and I sat on pad and watched and looked at the mountains and let them have it. After a while the sister came and thanked me. Her name was Margaret, and she had a direct way about her that reminded me of Nora. She asked if I'd eat. I said I would. We ate at a kitchen table that was bigger than mine, with Margaret's husband, a quiet man named Ellis who listened more than he talked, which I appreciated. And it was warm and the food was hot, and Nora sat across from me and ate everything that was put in front of her without apology. After supper, I sat on the porch alone for a while. The stars were the same stars I knew, just from a different angle. The cold was the same cold. Nora came out after a while and sat in the chair beside me. She said, "Are you going to stay?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "If you stayed a while, not forever, just a while things get settled." I looked at my hands, these hands that Ruth had always said something about. I said, "That's a big ask." She said, "I know." There was a quiet. She said, "You came through November mountains because you know the roads." I said, "I told you that was one reason." She looked at me. The porch light was weak and yellow, and it touched the side of her face, and she was looking at me like I was something she was being careful with, careful and certain at the same time. She put her hand on mine, just that. Her hand over mine on the arm of the chair, the way you cover something you intend to keep. She said, "You gave me a coat. You stood on a porch and sent 2 hard men away. You took me through a mountain pass in the snow." I said, "I didn't want you to get stuck on the wrong side of the pass." She said, "Calvin." I said, "What?" She said, "Shut up and stay." I looked at her hand on mine. I turned my hand over under hers. We sat there on that porch in Colorado with the cold all around and the lamplight behind us and her hand in mine, and I did not say anything else, and neither did she. The mountains were dark against the sky. The garden was quiet under its straw. Ferris was at home waiting for me, sleeping on the west side of the bed. All of that was true, and also this was true right here, right now. I stayed. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I'm done. I went back to the rafter tea not that night, not that week. About 3 months later in the early spring, when the roads were passable and Nora had her feet under her and her sister's house was feeling more like safety than like refuge. I went back to settle things, to see what needed doing after a winter away, to check the fence and the stock. I'd left them with a neighbor, a reliable man named Cates, but they were my animals and my land and they needed seeing to. I rode up to the place on a morning with the first real warmth of March in it, the kind of warmth that still has cold underneath but promises something. The cottonwoods along the creek were starting to bud, just barely, the first faint green that's more suggestion than fact. The gate was the same gate. The woodpile was lower but still good. Cates had done right by it. I went inside. The place was cold and still. I got the fire going and walked through it. The cracked axe handle was still against the woodpile. I'd never fixed it. I stood in the kitchen for a while. I stood in the doorway of the room where Nora had slept. There were 2 cups on the shelf from the last morning she'd drunk coffee in this house, and I'd never put them away. I stood in the other room, Ruth's room, the room I still didn't sleep in. I stood there for a long time. I looked at the photograph on the shelf, Ruth, on the porch, in the light of a summer afternoon, looking at something off to the side of whoever held the camera, her whole face alive with whatever it was. I had looked at that photograph 1,000 times since she died, and it had always hurt the same way. This time it hurt differently. Not less. Different. The way a healed bone hurts, still real, still yours, still the record of what happened, but no longer the only thing, no longer the thing that defines the shape of every room you walk into. I said something to her. I don't know that I need to put it here. It was between me and her, and the room and the light coming through the single window of that house I'd built on top of my father's foundation, on 60 acres that had been ours and were still mine. Then I put the photograph in my coat pocket and went back outside. The gelding was at the fence, watching me. I said, "You ready?" He shook his mane like he'd been ready for a while, and I was the one holding things up. I went to the axe and looked at the cracked handle. I picked it up and felt the weight of it, the familiar balance of it, the grain split from the eye down 4 inches. I set it back against the wood pile. Kate's could use the wood. The land would keep till I decided what to do with it. The axe could stay. I got on Pad and we went back the way we'd come. South. Through the pass. Down into the valley with the smoke and the fenced garden and a woman who had come to me trembling in a yard and pulled me back into the world without ever meaning to, just by being herself, just by needing what she needed and accepting what I gave, and giving back what she had, which was more than either of us had known she was holding. The mountains were white above us, and the road was long, and I had Ruth's photograph in my pocket, and the sun was getting warm and Pad moved easy beneath me, sure-footed, like he knew where he was going. I suppose we both did.